The gold-plated doors of Trump Tower reflected the bustling chaos of Manhattan's Fifth Avenue. Flashes of yellow cabs, hurried pedestrians, and luxury storefronts gleaming in the morning light. Inside, past the velvet ropes and marble floors, Donald J. Trump sat in his office, reviewing the latest economic briefings. At 78, the 47th President of the United States had lost none of his commanding presence. His suit, tailored to perfection, was as sharp as his mind, his signature golden hair combed back immaculately. Despite the weight of the nation on his shoulders, his focus remained razor-sharp, his energy unmatched. But outside, just beyond the grandeur of his empire, a woman stood in the cold, her frail figure wrapped in a tattered coat, gripping a worn-out cardboard sign. "Please help. Anything will do." Her name was Margaret Reynolds, and she had once lived a life of stability. But like so many, the tides of misfortune had swept her away. A sudden medical emergency, a lost job, an eviction notice, and just like that, she had gone from middle-class comfort to sleeping on the unforgiving sidewalks of New York. Today, however, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. Today, she was about to come face to face with the most powerful man in the country. The morning was frigid, the wind slicing through the city streets like a knife. Margaret shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to ignore the numbness creeping up her legs. She had seen countless people walk past her, some throwing sympathetic glances, others pretending she didn't exist. But she wasn't looking for pity. She needed a chance. A single moment where someone, anyone, would acknowledge that she still mattered. A pair of security guards near the entrance took notice of her, their expressions indifferent yet alert. One of them murmured something into a small radio clipped to his lapel. Margaret knew she was on borrowed time before they shooed her away like they always did. But she had made up her mind. This was her last attempt. If no one helped her today, she didn't know if she could survive another night on the streets. And then, the moment happened. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the entrance, its tinted windows concealing the figure inside. The door opened, and stepping out with the same unmistakable confidence he carried for decades, was Donald Trump. The commotion around the entrance heightened instantly. Staff members adjusted their earpieces, security tightened their perimeters, and a few onlookers pulled out their phones to capture the moment. But Margaret barely noticed any of it. She took a deep breath, clenched the edges of her sign, and stepped forward. "Mr. President," her voice wavered, a mix of desperation and determination. Trump, mid-stride, paused. He turned to look at her, his eyes sharp but unreadable. Margaret swallowed hard. This was it. Her one chance. I don't mean to bother you, sir," she stammered. "But I need help." For a split second, the world seemed to pause. The onlookers, the security team, even the wind, it all felt like it had stopped, waiting for what would happen next. Trump studied her for a moment. Then, with the decisiveness that had built his empire and won him the presidency twice, he nodded to one of his aides. "Get her inside." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. The security team hesitated for just a second before obeying. Margaret felt the warmth of a hand guiding her forward, past the towering gold doors, past the skeptical glances, and into the world of power and influence she had never dreamed she'd step foot in. And just like that, her life changed forever. The elevator ride was silent, but Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. ***, she could barely process what had just happened. One moment she had been standing in the cold, ignored like she was invisible, and now she was in an elevator inside Trump Tower, being led to a private meeting with the most powerful man in the country. ***. The opulence of the surroundings was almost overwhelming. The gold-trimmed walls, the plush carpets, everything here was a world apart from the streets she had called home. When the elevator doors slid open, she was ushered into a grand office, larger than any space she had stepped into in years. And there, behind a massive mahogany desk, sat Donald Trump. Margaret took a sharp breath. This was it. Trump didn't look up immediately. He was scanning a document in front of him, flipping a page, his expression unreadable. For a second, Margaret wondered if he had changed his mind. Maybe he was just being polite by bringing her inside, and any minute now, someone would escort her out. Then, he set the document aside and looked straight at her. His blue eyes were sharp, observant, not cold, but not softened with sympathy either. "Sit down," he said simply. Margaret hesitated. "Go on, I don't bite," Trump added, leaning back in his chair. She slowly lowered herself onto the chair across from him, gripping the edges of her cardboard sign for comfort. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Trump folded his hands together and asked, "What's your story?" The question caught Margaret off guard. No one had ever asked her that before, not in a way that made her feel like the answer actually mattered. She swallowed hard, suddenly unsure where to begin. I wasn't always homeless," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Trump didn't react. He simply waited, listening. Margaret inhaled deeply. She had never told her full story before, not like this. "I had a job, an apartment, a normal life. Then one day I got sick. Just one emergency room visit, and suddenly I had medical bills I couldn't pay. Then I lost my job. The eviction notice came before I could find another one. And then I had nowhere to go." She looked down at her hands, ashamed of how small her voice sounded. "I tried to get help. But every place I went, they put me on a waiting list. I was always one step too late, one form short, one rule away from qualifying for aid." She shook her head. "I don't want a handout. I just want my life back." Silence hung between them. Then Trump leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His gaze didn't waver. "You know what the problem is, Margaret?" She looked up, confused. Trump exhaled sharply. "The system. It's designed to keep you down. It throws you crumbs but never actually lets you get back up." Margaret blinked. That was the last thing she had expected him to say. These politicians talk about helping the homeless, but all they do is build more shelters. They don't fix the reason people end up there in the first place. Margaret swallowed. She had never thought about it like that before. Trump continued, "The country doesn't need more handouts. It needs opportunities. People need a way out of the cycle, not just a blanket and a bowl of soup." She was speechless. Then he leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger on the desk. "So, what do you want?" Margaret hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. For months, all she had wanted was to survive. To get through the next day, the next night, the next freezing storm. But now, sitting across from the President of the United States, a man who had built and rebuilt his empire more times than she could count, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She straightened her back and forced herself to speak. "I want my life back," she whispered. Trump nodded once, as if that was exactly the answer he expected. Then he made a decision in seconds. "Done." Margaret's breath caught. "What?" Trump exhaled, speaking like the matter had already been settled. "You're not getting a handout. You're getting a job. A second chance. You start next week." Margaret stared at him. She had expected pity. Maybe a small donation. A polite apology that there was nothing he could do. But this was so much more. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time They weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of hope. Within hours, her entire life changed. She was given a place to stay, a fresh set of clothes, and a full medical checkup, paid for in full. But the real change? Trump had arranged a job for her at one of his hotels. No charity. An opportunity. And as she lay in her warm hotel bed that night, Margaret realized something she never thought she'd feel again. She had a future. The story went viral overnight. Trump helps homeless woman get back on her feet. Is this America First in action? Donald Trump's unexpected act of kindness shocks everyone. From the streets to Trump Tower, the Margaret Reynolds story. For the first time in years, Margaret's phone was ringing. Not with debt collectors. Not with more bad news. But with job offers, interview requests, and messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. But she ignored most of them. Because for the first time in forever, she didn't need pity. She had purpose. And it was all because one man had stopped, listened, and given her a real chance. Margaret Reynolds stepped out of the Trump International Hotel, the crisp morning air brushing against her skin. But this time, she wasn't shivering in the cold. She adjusted the gold name badge pinned to her blazer, smoothed out her new uniform, and walked with a confidence she had almost forgotten she had. She wasn't just another homeless woman on the streets of New York anymore. She was employed, stable, standing on her own feet again. And it had all started with a single moment outside Trump Tower. Margaret had no idea how big her story had become, until she walked into the hotel lobby and saw her own face on a television screen. A homeless woman asks Donald Trump for help. His answer will leave you in tears. The headline ran across every major network. News anchors debated whether Trump's act of kindness was a political move or a genuine moment of compassion. But Margaret didn't care what they thought. For her, it wasn't about politics. It was about survival. About someone seeing her when the rest of the world had walked past. She stood at the front desk, clocking in for work, when one of her co-workers, a woman named Gina, smiled at her. "Hey, superstar. You ready for another crazy day?" Margaret chuckled. She never thought she'd hear someone call her that. But here she was, earning her way back into life, one shift at a time. Donald Trump sat behind his desk, flipping through the morning news reports. The Margaret Reynolds story had gained more traction than even he had expected. He smirked, tossing the paper aside. "What's the reaction?" he asked, looking at his chief of staff. The aide glanced at his phone. "Most people are praising it. Even some of your critics are saying this was the right thing to do." Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. "And the haters?" His aide sighed. "Some say it was a publicity stunt." Trump chuckled. "They'd rather I ignore her, huh?" The aide hesitated. "Sir, there's something else. Margaret has been getting offers. People want to interview her. Even some of the networks that attack you daily." Trump raised an eyebrow. "And what does she say?" The aide smiled. "She's turned them all down." For the first time that morning, Trump looked genuinely surprised. A few days later, Margaret sat across from a reporter in a quiet coffee shop. She had been bombarded with interview requests, but she had only agreed to one, a small independent journalist who had reached out respectfully, without an agenda. The reporter adjusted his mic and smiled. "Margaret, your story has gone viral. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I was cold, tired, hungry. I didn't think anyone would stop. But when President Trump walked out, I had to try." The reporter leaned forward. "And what did he say?" Margaret smiled, shaking her head. It's funny. People expect me to say that he gave me money or told me he felt sorry for me. But that's not what happened at all. She looked straight into the camera. He looked at me and said, "What do you want?" The reporter paused, intrigued. "And what did you say?" Margaret exhaled. "I told him I wanted my life back." She let the words settle before continuing. "And he said, 'Done.' Just like that." The reporter blinked. "Just like that." Margaret nodded. "Just like that." He didn't see me as a victim. He saw me as someone who needed an opportunity. And that's what he gave me. A job, a place to stay. He didn't hand me a check and walk away. He actually gave me the chance to rebuild. The journalist took a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. "Margaret, there are a lot of people out there debating whether this was a publicity stunt or not. What do you say to them?" She smiled. "I say that when I was sleeping on the streets, none of those people ever stopped to help me." He did. Silence. Then, the journalist cleared his throat. "And how has your life changed since that day?" Margaret's smile grew. "I have a job. I have a home. And for the first time in years, I have hope." A month later, Margaret found herself back in Trump Tower. Only this time, she wasn't a homeless woman standing outside. She was a woman with a future. She was led into Trump's office, where he sat reviewing documents. As she stepped inside, he glanced up, then smirked. "Well, well. Look who made it." Margaret chuckled. "You said you don't do handouts. And you were right. You gave me a job, and I ran with it." Trump leaned back in his chair, nodding. "That's how you win, Margaret. Nobody's gonna hand you success. You gotta take it." She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Why did you help me, Mr. President? Really?" Trump exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk. For the first time, he looked genuinely thoughtful. Then, he answered, "Because I know what it's like to be underestimated." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. Trump leaned forward. "They counted you out, didn't they? Just like they always try to count me out." She nodded, unable to speak. Trump smirked. "Never let them. Keep winning." Margaret smiled through her tears. She had fought. She had survived. And thanks to one moment of kindness, she had won.